The gold coins struck the table one by one, and each ring of metal felt to Arya like the closing of a door. She stood pressed against the cold stone wall of the Crossways Tavern, her fingers knotted in her apron, watching a stranger buy her life for the price of a horse. Rain tapped at the small window. Outside, the dusty valley road stretched empty in both directions, and somewhere a bell tolled the noon hour across the moors. "That is the last of it," said her stepmother, Mrs. Vance, sweeping the coins into her gloved palm with the greed of a woman who had waited years for this moment. "The debt is cleared. The girl is yours." Arya's heart slammed against her ribs. "Yours?" The word broke from her lips before she could stop it. "You cannot sell a person. This is England, not some—" "Hold your tongue," Mrs. Vance snapped, not even turning to look at her. "It is a contract of service, nothing more, perfectly legal. Sign here, sir, and the matter is settled forever." Arya's eyes flew to the stranger. He was a tall man, perhaps 36, wrapped in a heavy dark traveling cloak that hid most of his frame. The hood shadowed his face, but she could see a strong jaw, a mouth set in a hard line, and eyes the color of storm clouds. He had not spoken a single word since he entered. He simply listened, still as carved oak, while Mrs. Vance rattled off her terms and complaints and false pities. When she pushed the paper toward him, the man drew off one leather glove. Arya caught a glimpse of a scar running across the back of his hand, an old wound, pale and long. He dipped the quill and signed his name in a single firm stroke. He did not offer it to be read. "There," Mrs. Vance said brightly. "You'll find she's a hard worker, scrubs floors, minds the fire, keeps quiet. My late husband spoiled her with too much reading, but you'll cure her of that soon enough." At the mention of her father, Arya felt her throat tighten. Her father had been a gentleman, a former soldier who came home from the wars with a limp and a chest full of medals he never displayed. He had taught her Latin by candlelight and told her stories of the mountains of the north. When he died 3 winters past, Mrs. Vance had shown her true face within a week. The house was mortgaged, the debts were vast, and Arya, the stepdaughter, was the cheapest thing in the household to sell. The stranger rose from his chair. He was even taller standing, and the low beams of the tavern nearly brushed the top of his hood. He crossed to Arya in 3 slow steps, and she shrank back against the wall, certain she was about to be seized and dragged off like cargo. Instead, he stopped an arm's length away. He reached into the folds of his cloak and drew out her small cloth satchel, the one that held everything she owned in the world. Her spare dress, a wooden comb, a single iron key on a bit of ribbon that her father had pressed into her hand on his deathbed with the whispered words, "Keep this, and one day you will understand." She had no idea how the stranger had come to be holding it. Mrs. Vance must have handed it over while Arya was distracted. Yet the sight of it in his large, scarred hand made her stomach turn cold. He held the satchel out to her. Arya did not take it. She lifted her chin, though her whole body was shaking. "I do not know who you are, sir, or where you mean to take me. But I will tell you plainly, I am not a slave. If you treat me cruelly, I will run. I have run from worse." For the first time, something shifted in the man's shadowed face. It was not anger. It was something quieter, something that almost looked like the ghost of a smile, gone as quickly as it came. He said nothing. He simply pressed the satchel gently into her arms and stepped back, motioning with one hand toward the tavern door. Through the doorway, in the muddy yard, waited a carriage. Arya had never seen such a carriage. It was black as polished coal, drawn by 4 gray horses, with wheels rimmed in silver and lamps of fine glass hanging at its corners. There was no crest painted on the door, no name, no mark of any family or house. It was the sort of carriage a very great person would use when they did not wish to be known. A cold thread of fear wound through her. A humble master she could understand, a cruel farmer, a tavern keeper, a merchant needing a scullery maid. But this man traveled like a prince and hid his name like a criminal, and Arya could not decide which frightened her more. "Well, go on," Mrs. Vance said, already turning to count her coins again by the window light. "And do try not to disgrace your father's memory more than you already have." That was the last cruelty, and it landed hardest. Arya's eyes stung, but she refused to let a single tear fall in front of that woman. She pulled her thin shawl tight around her shoulders, gripped her satchel, and walked out into the rain with her head held high. The stranger followed a pace behind her. He handed her up into the carriage himself, his gloved hand steady beneath hers, and she noticed that he was careful, almost gentle, as though she were made of something that might break. Then he climbed in and settled onto the seat across from her, and the door shut with a heavy, final click. The carriage lurched forward. Through the small window, Arya watched the Crossways Tavern shrink into the gray distance, and with it the only world she had ever known. She turned to study her new master. He had pushed back his hood at last. His hair was dark, threaded here and there with the first strands of silver, and his face, now that she could see it fully, was not the face of a cruel man. It was tired, weathered. And when his gray eyes met hers, she felt the strangest jolt, a feeling she could not name, as though somewhere, long ago, she had seen those eyes before. "You needn't be afraid of me," the man said. It was the first time he had spoken. His voice was low and rough, like a road little traveled. Then he lifted his ledger, opened it upon his knee, and said not one word more for the rest of that long, rain-soaked day. By the second morning, Arya had learned 3 things about the man who had bought her. He rose before dawn, he ate almost nothing, only a heel of bread and a cup of black tea taken standing in the inn yard, and he did not speak unless there was a plain reason to, which meant he did not speak to her at all. The carriage climbed higher into the hills as the hours passed. The soft green valleys of the lowlands gave way to steep gray slopes dotted with sheep, then to bare rock and heather, then at last to a narrow mountain pass where the wind moaned against the carriage walls and the horses labored hard against the grade. Arya pressed her face to the window and watched the land turn wild. She had never in her life traveled so far from the tavern. Each mile that fell behind them was a mile she did not know how to walk back. Across from her, Arthur read. He had a leather satchel full of papers, and he moved through them with a steady patience, dipping a small traveling pen into an ink pot fixed clever into the arm of the seat, making his marks, turning the page. Columns of figures, letters sealed with wax that he broke with his thumb. Now and again he frowned at something, and the scar on his hand would catch the gray daylight. Arya decided he was a hard man, a man who cared for coin and ledgers, and nothing warmer. She had met his sort before, the ones who counted people the same way they counted shillings, and she folded her arms and stared out the window, and told herself she would not be fooled by a soft word spoken once in the rain. Yet the doubts crept in against her will. A hard man did not pay for a private room. A hard man did not order that a stranger's boots be dried by the fire while she slept. Twice now, she had woken to find a blanket tucked around her that she had not placed there herself, and she could not fathom why a master would trouble himself over the comfort of a girl he had bought to scrub his floors. At midday, they stopped to rest the horses beside a cold, running stream. Arthur stepped down and walked a little way off, his back to the carriage, looking out across the valley with his cloak snapping in the wind. Arya seized the moment. She leaned toward the driver, a stout old man named Bram, with kind eyes and a great white beard. "Where is he taking me?" she whispered. "Please, I have a right to know." Bram glanced toward his master and lowered his voice. "North, miss, to the great house. That is all I am permitted to say." He hesitated, then added more gently, "You've naught to fear from him. I've driven for the master 11 years. There's not a cruel bone in the man, whatever face he wears. Arya wanted to believe it, but she had believed in a kind home once and woken to find it gone. She thanked Bram and said no more. They rode on. As the light began to fail, the carriage rolled into the yard of a wayside inn tucked against the mountainside, its windows warm and golden, smoke curling from its chimney. The sign above the door showed a stag with a lantern in its antlers. Arthur handed her down, spoke a few quiet words to the innkeeper, and then, as ever, disappeared into his own silence, climbing the stairs to see to the horses' stabling. Arya stood alone in the crowded common room. Travelers laughed over their supper. A fire roared. And a plan took shape in her mind, sudden and fierce. This was her chance. She knew nothing of the man's true purpose, and she would not wait meekly to discover it at the end of the road. If she slipped away now, into the mountains, she might find a village, a coaching route, some honest household in need of a maid who asked no wages but safety. Better a hard life she chose than a fine one she did not. She waited until the innkeeper's wife bustled off toward the kitchen. Then she pulled her shawl over her head, kept low, and made for the back passage that led past the scullery toward the yard. Her heart hammered. Her satchel bumped against her hip. She reached the rear door, lifted the latch, and pushed out into the cold blue dusk. She had taken perhaps 6 steps into the yard when a voice stopped her. "Now then, miss, you'll not want to be going out that way." It was the innkeeper himself, a broad man with a lantern, standing between her and the dark road as though he had been expecting her. "The pass is no place for a young lady after dark. There's bogs off the track that have swallowed grown men whole, and the cold up here can finish by morning. Come back inside where it's warm." "I only wished for air," Arya said quickly, though her face burned with the lie. The innkeeper's expression was not unkind. "Air you can have at the window. Your master has seen to everything. Come." She had no choice but to follow him back inside, her escape crumbling to nothing before it had begun. She braced herself for anger, for a locked door, for the master's cold displeasure at her attempt to flee. Instead, the innkeeper's wife led her up a narrow stair to a chamber at the end of the hall, and when the door opened, Arya stopped short on the threshold. It was the finest room she had ever set foot in. A great bed with clean white linen and a coverlet of deep green. A fire already lit and dancing in the grate. A basin of warm water for washing. A cake of proper soap, and folded upon a chair, a fresh nightgown of soft cotton laid out for her. On a small table by the window waited a covered supper. She lifted the cloth and found roast fowl, buttered bread, stewed apples, and a pot of tea still steaming. "Master's orders," said the innkeeper's wife. "Best room in the house, and anything more you should require, you've only to ring the bell. He was most particular about it." She smiled at Arya's stunned face and drew the door softly closed. Arya sank down onto the edge of the great bed, her satchel slipping from her fingers to the floor. She thought of the coins ringing on the tavern table, of the cold silence in the carriage, of the blanket she had woken beneath and could not explain. A cruel man would have thrown her in a stable loft for trying to run. This man had sent her a feast and a fire and had not so much as sent up a word of reproach. She stared into the flames a long while, more confused than she had ever been in her life. Nothing about him made the smallest sense. They traveled 2 more days through country that grew ever more grand and lonely. The mountain pass opened at last, onto a high plateau ringed by dark pine forests, and the air turned sharp and clean, scented with resin and cold stone. Arya had stopped trying to plan an escape. There was nowhere to run to now, only endless trees and empty sky. And so she sat and watched the wild land roll by and tried to steel herself for whatever waited at the end of the road. On the 4th day of the journey, the carriage rounded a shoulder of the hillside, and Arya drew a sharp breath. Below them,
In a broad green valley, cradled by the pines, stood a house so vast it might have been mistaken for a small town.
Grey stone walls rose in tiers against the mountainside, crowned with towers and steep slate roofs and 100 glittering windows that caught the afternoon sun. A great iron gate stood open at the end of a long avenue lined with ancient oaks. Beyond it spread gardens, stables, orchards, and a lake as still and bright as a looking-glass.
"What is this place?"
she whispered. Arthur, folding away his ledger for the first time in days, looked out at it with an expression she could not read. "Home," he said simply. The carriage rolled through the gate and up the sweeping avenue. As it drew near the great front steps, Arya saw servants emerging from the house, a whole line of them, footmen in dark livery, maids in crisp aprons, a stately woman in grey with a ring of keys at her waist. They arranged themselves along the steps with the smoothness of long practice, and every one of them turned to face the carriage as it halted. Bram climbed down and opened the door. Arthur stepped out first, and the moment his boot touched the gravel, every servant on those steps bowed or curtsied as one, low and reverent.
"Welcome home, Your Grace,"
said the woman in grey. The words struck Arya like cold water. Your Grace. She knew what that meant. Everyone in England knew. It was not the greeting given to a merchant, or a squire, or even a lord. It was the address reserved for a duke, the highest rank a man could hold beneath a prince of the blood. The silent stranger who had bought her contract for a handful of gold, the man who read ledgers and tucked blankets and hid his name, was one of the greatest men in the whole of the kingdom. Arya's mind reeled. She gripped the edge of the carriage door to steady herself. Arthur turned and offered his hand to help her down. She took it because her knees felt uncertain, and she descended onto the gravel in her thin traveling dress and her worn shawl, feeling every eye in that grand assembly settle upon her. She was painfully aware of how she must look, a shabby tavern girl set down amid all this splendor like a sparrow dropped among peacocks. "This is Miss Arya," Arthur said to the woman in grey. His voice carried a quiet authority that brooked no questions. "She is my guest. She is to be given the blue chamber and every courtesy of the house. See that she wants for nothing." The woman's eyebrows lifted the smallest fraction, but her face remained smooth as she curtsied again.
"Of course, Your Grace. Mrs. Hollis, at your service, miss. If you would follow me."
Arya did not move. Her fear had curdled into something sharper, a determination born of too many days of not knowing. She had promised herself she would not be led about like a lamb any longer.
"No,"
she said. The word rang out across the gravel. A footman's head turned. Mrs. Hollis went very still. Arya stepped in front of Arthur, and though her heart was pounding, she looked up into those grey eyes and held them.
"You have carried me for 4 days across half of England without a word of explanation. You buy me from that woman like a sack of grain, and then you feed me and warm me and give me fine rooms, and now I learn you're a duke of all things. I will go no further into your house until you tell me plainly. What do you want from me?"
A hush fell over the steps. Servants did not speak so to a duke. Arya half expected to be struck or thrown out the gate, or worse. Arthur regarded her for a long moment. The hard line of his mouth softened, and once again she caught that flicker of something in his face, the same near smile she had glimpsed in the tavern, quickly mastered. "You are brave," he said quietly. "Your father was the same." The mention of her father landed like a stone dropped into still water. Arya's breath caught.
"You knew my father?"
Something crossed Arthur's face then, a shadow of old grief, deep and worn smooth by years. But he did not answer the question. He looked away, toward the great doors of the house, and when he spoke again, his voice had gone carefully even. "You are tired and cold, and you have traveled a long way," he said. "There will be time for every answer, I promise you that, but not on the front steps in the wind. Rest tonight, eat, sleep in a warm bed, and tomorrow, when your strength is returned, we will speak of all of it." He paused. "You are safe here, Arya. Whatever else you doubt, believe that. No harm will come to you under this roof while I draw breath." There was such weight in the words, such quiet certainty, that Arya found she could not argue against them. She searched his face for the cruelty she had been so sure of, and she could not find it. She found only weariness, and beneath it, something that looked almost like sorrow.
"You knew my father,"
she said again, softer now, no longer a question but a wondering.
"How?"
"Tomorrow," he said, and there was a gentleness in the single word that undid the last of her resolve. Mrs. Hollis stepped forward. "Come, miss. You'll feel a great deal steadier after a hot bath and a night's sleep. Cook has a good supper on, and the blue chamber has the finest view in all the house over the lake." Arya let herself be led, because she was suddenly too weary to do otherwise, and because the mystery of it all had grown too vast to fight standing in the cold. She followed Mrs. Hollis up the great steps and through doors tall enough for a giant into a hall of marble and warm lamplight, past portraits of stern-faced men and women in the dress of ages past. Somewhere behind her, she heard Arthur giving low instructions to his steward, his voice fading as she climbed. But her mind had fixed upon one thing, and it would not let go. He had known her father. This grand and silent duke, at the far edge of the world, had spoken her father's name with grief in his eyes, and Arya was going to learn why. Arya woke to sunlight pouring through tall windows, and for one blissful moment forgot where she was. The bed was deep and soft, the linens smelled of lavender, and beyond the glass stretched the silver lake she had glimpsed the night before, ringed by dark pines. A maid named Peggy, a cheerful girl of perhaps 16, brought a tray of fresh bread, honey, and warm milk, and helped Arya into a borrowed morning dress of pale gray muslin that fit her almost perfectly. Arya could not think how they had found her measure so quickly, until she remembered Mrs. Hollis's sharp eye on the steps. "His Grace is away today, miss," Peggy said, brushing out Arya's long hair. "Rode out at first light on estate business. He said you were to have the run of the house and grounds, and to rest as you please." Away. So the promised answers would have to wait another day. Arya might have chafed at that, but the truth was she was glad of the time. She wished to understand this strange place before she faced its master again. And so, once she had eaten, she set out to explore. The house was a wonder. Long galleries hung with paintings, a library whose doors were shut fast, drawing rooms of silk and gilt, a music room with a great harp beneath a dust cloth. She walked slowly, touching nothing, feeling like a trespasser in a dream. The servants she passed nodded to her kindly and did not question her wandering, which unsettled her nearly as much as cruelty would have. She was accustomed to being watched, suspected, ordered about. This gentle freedom was a language she did not speak. By midday, she found her way to the conservatory. It was a vast chamber of glass and white-painted iron, built out from the eastern wing, and stepping into it was like stepping into another country. Warm air, thick with the green scent of growing things. Palms and ferns from distant lands, orange trees heavy with fruit, banks of flowers she had no names for, all glowing in the light that streamed through the high glass roof. A little fountain trickled somewhere among the leaves.
Arya wandered down a gravel path between the beds, and for the first time since the tavern, she felt something in her chest begin to loosen. Then she heard voices and froze. Two people were speaking on the far side of a tall bank of ferns, close enough that she could hear every word, though the greenery hid her from their view. A man and a woman, their accents polished, their tones the lazy, drawling kind that Arya had learned long ago to mistrust.
"Cannot imagine what possessed him," the woman was saying.
"A duke of his standing, and he brings home some ragged creature bought off a tavern keeper. It is the talk of 3 counties already."
"A debt girl," the man said, and Arya heard the sneer in it. "Purchased like a mule at market. They say the stepmother sold her to clear a common tradesman's debt. Can you conceive of it? And now he means to seat her at his own table." Arya's face burned. Her hand tightened on the fold of her borrowed dress.
"He has always been peculiar," the woman went on. "Ever since the wars, buried up here in the north, refusing every invitation, letting the great families forget he exists. But this is beyond peculiar. If he presents that girl at the autumn gala, he will be laughed out of society. A creature who has scrubbed floors, curtsying among duchesses."
"Which is precisely the opportunity, my dear." The man's voice dropped, and Arya had to strain to catch it. "Half the county will be at the gala. Let him bring his little tavern maid. We need only see to it that everyone learns exactly what she is and where he found her, at the right moment and before the right people. One good humiliation and the mighty duke becomes a laughing stock. His name, his influence, all of it undone by his own foolish charity." The woman gave a soft, cold laugh. "You are wicked." "I am practical. He has stood too high for too long. It costs us nothing to let a girl's own past do the work of pulling him down." Arya stood rooted to the gravel, her heart hammering. Every word was a small blade. She had known the world thought little of a tavern girl. She had not known that her mere presence here, in Arthur's house, could be turned into a weapon against him. She had come to this place a frightened stranger, certain the Duke meant her some private harm. Now she understood that the harm ran the other way. He had taken her in, given her shelter and dignity, and in doing so had made himself a target for people like these, people who smiled at his table and plotted his ruin behind his ferns. The pair moved off toward the far doors, their voices fading into the trickle of the fountain, and Arya let out a breath she had not known she was holding. She sank onto a stone bench among the orange trees, her thoughts churning. She thought of the coins on the tavern table, of the blanket tucked around her in the night, of the way Arthur had said, "You are safe here," as though he meant it with his whole soul. She had spent 4 days believing him her captor. She had tried to run from him, and all the while he had been quietly ruining his own standing among his own kind, for her sake, and asking nothing in return. Why? The question that had haunted her since the tavern rose up again, sharper now. Whatever his reason, it was costing him dearly. A man did not throw away the good opinion of society, did not invite the scorn of dukes and their scheming wives out of idle whim. There was something behind it, something to do with her father and the grief she had seen in his eyes on the steps. She rose from the bench, and a new resolve hardened within her, quite different from the resolve to escape that had ruled her only days before. She would not be the ruin of the one man who had shown her kindness. Whatever these people planned, she would not let herself become the blade they turned against him. But to defend him, she first had to understand him. She had to know what bound this powerful, silent man to a soldier's daughter from a roadside tavern. She had to know the truth he kept promising and never gave. Her gaze drifted through the glass, across the gardens, toward the eastern wing of the house, where a set of doors had been shut fast against her all morning. The library. Arthur was away until nightfall. The house was quiet, and somewhere behind those closed doors, she felt certain,
lay the beginning of an answer. Arya smoothed her borrowed dress, lifted her chin, and set off through the warm green air toward the conservatory doors, her mind already turning toward locks and keys and the small iron key that hung even now on its ribbon beneath her collar, close against her heart. The library doors were not locked after all. Arya had expected to find them barred against her, but the great brass handle turned easily beneath her hand, and the tall doors swung inward without a sound. She slipped inside and drew them shut behind her, her heart beating fast, half certain some servant would appear to send her away. None came. The room was empty and still and vast. It rose 2 full stories, ringed by galleries reached by a spiral iron stair, and every wall was lined with books, thousands upon thousands of them, their leather spines glowing in the light that fell through the high windows. The air smelled of paper and beeswax and old wood. A great fireplace stood cold at one end, and before it, angled toward the light, was a heavy writing desk of dark oak. Arya crossed the room slowly, awed into silence. She had loved books all her life, in a house where reading was counted a fault, and to stand among so many at once was like standing in a church. Her father would have wept to see it. He had owned perhaps a dozen books and had treasured every one. The thought of her father drew her toward the desk. It was neatly kept, a tray of pens, a stand of ink, a stack of correspondence weighted with a smooth gray stone. And there, at the corner, half hidden behind a globe of the world, sat a small wooden box. Arya stopped. It was old, that box, older than anything else on the desk. The wood was dark with age and worn smooth at the corners, banded in tarnished iron, and set into its front was a small iron lock. There was nothing grand about it. Amid all the gilt and polish of that great house, it looked plain, almost poor, like a thing that had traveled hard and been kept for love rather than value. And the lock! Arya's breath caught. The lock was of a particular old-fashioned make, a squat iron keyhole shaped like a clover leaf, and she knew that shape. She had seen it every day of her life, hanging on a ribbon against her heart. Her hands trembled as she drew the key from beneath her collar. It could not be. It was surely only chance, only some common pattern of locksmith's work. Her father had given her the key with no lock to open, had pressed it into her hand as he lay dying, and told her, "Keep this, and one day you will understand." For 3 long years the key had opened nothing, meant nothing, been only a scrap of memory she could not bear to part with. She lifted the box in both hands. It was heavier than it looked. She set it down before her, fitted the small iron key to the clover-shaped hole, and turned. The lock gave with a soft, oiled click. For a moment Arya did not lift the lid. She stood with her palms flat upon it, her whole body gone still, understanding that whatever lay inside was going to change everything, and half afraid to know it. Then she raised the lid. Inside lay letters, a thick bundle of them, tied with faded ribbon, the paper soft and yellowed with years. Beneath them lay 2 small books bound in worn brown leather, the kind a soldier might carry in his pack. And atop it all, folded once, was a portrait in miniature. A woman with Arya's own dark eyes and gentle mouth. Her mother. The mother she had never known, who had died bringing her into the world. Arya's vision blurred. She lifted the little portrait with shaking fingers and pressed it to her lips, and for a long moment she could do nothing at all but weep silently in that vast and quiet room. When she could see again, she set the portrait carefully aside and took up the first of the leather books. She opened it, and there, in a hand she would have known among 10,000, was her father's writing. It was a journal, a soldier's journal, kept through the long years of the wars. She turned the pages slowly, and her father's voice rose up out of them, plain and steady and dear, describing marches and cold camps and the men he served beside. And on the very first page, beneath the date, he had written a name that made Arya's heart stop. Arthur. She read on, faster now, her eyes racing across the lines. Her father wrote of a fellow officer, a younger man of great courage and few words, whom he called only Arthur, or sometimes, my truest friend in this whole cursed war. The two had served together through campaign after campaign. Her father had pulled Arthur wounded from a river once. Arthur had carried her father 3 miles through the snow when fever took him. They had saved each other's lives so many times that the debt between them, her father wrote, could never be counted, only honored. Arya sank into the great chair behind the desk, the journal open in her lap, and read until her eyes ached. Near the end of the second book, the entries grew shorter, the hand less steady, written after her father had come home to his limp and his medals and his quiet life.
And there, on one of the last pages, she found the passage that undid her. Arthur came to me today, her father had written. I told him of the debts and of my fears for my girl should the fever take me before she is grown. He would not hear of my worry. He swore to me, upon his honor and his name, that if ever I should die and leave Arya unprotected, he would find her wherever she might be and stand as her guardian in my place. He would let no harm come to her while he lived. I have given him the twin of the key I gave my Arya, that he might know her by it, and she him. I go easier now, knowing my oldest friend keeps watch. There is no truer man in England. The journal slipped from Arya's hands. She sat very still, the great library silent around her, and let the whole of it settle over her at once. The silent stranger in the tavern, the gold paid to erase the debt, the blanket in the night, the feast at the inn, the fine rooms, the words, "You are safe here." It had never been servitude. It had never been charity, nor whim, nor cruelty of any kind. It had been a promise. A soldier's oath, sworn between two friends in the mud and cold of war, kept in secret across all the long years since. Arthur had not bought her. He had rescued her. He had found the poor souled daughter of his dead comrade and carried her home, and asked nothing, and told her nothing, and let her think the worst of him rather than break the quiet dignity of the thing. Arya pressed her hand to her mouth, and this time the tears that came were not of grief. Behind her, unheard, the library doors eased open. "So," said Arthur's low voice from the doorway, "you have found it." Arya rose from the chair, the journal clutched against her chest, and turned to face him. Arthur stood in the doorway, still dusty from the road, his cloak over one arm, his dark hair wind-blown. He made no move to cross the room. He simply looked at her, and at the open box upon his desk, and at the little iron key that hung once more against her collar. And something in his weathered face gave way, like a wall that had held back a river for too long. "I meant to tell you gently," he said. "Tomorrow, over breakfast, in the light, with time to answer every question. I did not wish for you to learn it alone, from cold paper."
You knew my father.
Arya's voice shook.
You were his friend. His truest friend, he wrote. And you swore to him.
She could not finish. The words were too large. "Come," Arthur said quietly. "Not here. Walk with me." He led her from the library, through the long galleries, out through a set of glass doors onto a wide stone terrace that overlooked the lake. The afternoon had turned golden. The water lay still below them, and the pines stood dark against a sky going soft with the first colors of evening. Arya walked to the balustrade and gripped the cool stone. and Arthur came to stand a little apart, his hands clasped behind his back, looking out over the valley as though he could see the past in it. "Your father saved my life," he said at last, "more times than I can rightly number. I was a young man then, rash and proud, and I would have died a dozen deaths in that war had he not been at my side to pull me back from every one. He was the finest man I ever knew, braver than any general, and gentler than any priest." A faint, sad smile touched his mouth. "He used to speak of you every night in camp, his aria at home, learning her Latin. He carried you through the whole of that war like a lamp he kept lit against the dark." Arya's throat ached. "He never spoke of you," she whispered. "Not once. In all my life." "No." Arthur's jaw tightened. "He would not have. That was the way of the oath between us. When he told me of his fears, of the debts, of what might become of you if the fever took him, I swore I would watch over you. But he made me promise something more. He made me promise that if I ever had to act, I would do it quietly, without fanfare, without laying upon you the weight of a great man's charity." He turned to face her at last, and his gray eyes were bright. "Your father was a proud man, Arya, and he raised a proud daughter. He did not want you handed a gilded life like alms to a beggar. He wanted you to keep your own dignity. So I kept my silence, and I watched, and I waited." "You watched?" Arya stared at him. "All this time?" "From a distance. I had men make quiet inquiries, once a year, twice. I learned when your father died. I learned of the stepmother, of the mortgaged house, of the debts closing in." His voice hardened. "And then, 3 weeks passed, I learned that the woman meant to sell your contract of service to settle her accounts, to whatever man would pay. I could not allow that. There is no telling what manner of household you might have been sold into, what cruelty, what danger. So I went myself. I could not simply appear and announce that a duke had come to claim you, for she would have scented gold and held you to ransom, and half the county would have made a spectacle of it. The only way to free you cleanly, without scandal, without giving that woman the smallest hold over you, was to do exactly what she expected. To pay her price, take the contract, and carry you away before she thought to wonder who I was." Arya understood it now, all of it, the pieces falling into place one after another. The unmarked carriage, the hidden name, the silence that she had taken for cruelty, and that had in truth been the careful, patient keeping of a promise. "You used her own greed against her," she said slowly. "You let her sell me, so that I would be free of her forever, and she would never know what she had given away." "A contract of service can be ended by the one who holds it," Arthur said. "The moment we passed beyond that tavern yard, you were free, Arya. You have been free since the first mile. Not my servant, not my ward even, unless you should wish it. A guest in my house, and the daughter of the best man I ever knew, and welcome here for as long as you desire to stay." He paused, and his voice gentled. "I am sorry for the fear I caused you. I saw it on your face at every turn, and it grieved me to keep silent. But I judged your safety more urgent than your comfort. I hope, in time, you may forgive me for it." For a long moment, Arya could not speak at all. She thought of the frightened girl who had walked out into the rain at the Crossways Tavern, certain she was being sold into misery. She thought of every hour she had spent hating this man, planning to flee him, believing him her enemy. And she thought of what he had truly been through all of it. A friend keeping faith with the dead, guarding her in secret at cost to himself, asking nothing. The tears came at last, and she did not fight them. "There is nothing to forgive," she managed.
You kept a promise to my father when you might so easily have forgotten it. You crossed half of England for a girl you had never met, because you gave your word 20 years ago in the cold and the dark.
She pressed the journal to her heart.
My whole life I believed I had no one, that when my father died, I was alone in the world. And all this time, someone was watching. Someone was keeping faith.
Arthur's composure cracked. He looked away toward the lake, and she saw him draw a slow breath, mastering himself.
"You were never alone," he said, low. "Not for one day. I would have come sooner had I known how bad it had grown. That is my one regret, that I did not come sooner."
Arya crossed the space between them. She was a small figure beside his tall, cloak-worn frame, but she reached up and laid her hand upon his scarred one, where it rested on the balustrade, the hand that had signed her free, and she held it.
You came, she said simply. That is all that matters.
They stood together in the golden light, the daughter and the guardian, the war long over and the oath at last fulfilled, while the lake turned to fire beneath the sinking sun. Neither of them saw the rider on the far road, spurring hard toward the township below, carrying word to a woman who had begun, too late, to count the true worth of what she had sold. Mrs. Vance had not counted her gold twice before the doubts began. She had ridden away from the Crossways Tavern well pleased, the debt cleared and her purse heavy, and for a full week she had let herself believe she had made a shrewd bargain. But a bargain is only shrewd if one knows the true price of what one sells, and Mrs. Vance had begun to wonder what she had truly sold. The questions started at market. A carter who had been at the tavern that day spoke of the grand black carriage, the 4 grey horses, the silver on the wheels. A saddler recalled the cut of the stranger's cloak, the fineness of his boots, the quiet way the innkeeper had bowed to him, though no coin had yet changed hands. Piece by piece, Mrs. Vance assembled a portrait of the man who had bought her stepdaughter, and the portrait was not that of a poor farmer wanting a scullery made. By the second week, she had learned his name. She was taking tea with the vicar's wife when it came out, spoken lightly, as gossip.
A great personage had passed through the district some weeks past, traveling north in secret. The Grand Duke himself, no less, master of half the northern territory, one of the richest men in all of England, so rich that his yearly income was spoken of in whispers, and no one could rightly name the sum. Mrs. Vance had set down her teacup very carefully to keep her hand from shaking. A duke. She had sold Arya to a duke. For a handful of gold that would not keep her a 12-month, she had handed over the girl to a man who could have paid 100 times the price and not felt the loss. The thought of it kept her awake at night, gnawing, until greed hardened into a scheme. For Mrs. Vance was not a woman to accept a loss. If the girl was worth so much to the Duke, then the Duke could be made to pay for her, and pay dearly. She had only to find the proper means. She made her inquiries. She learned the road the carriage had taken, the northern route through the mountains, and she learned that a young woman answering to Arya's description had been seen at the great estate in the Pine Valley, dressed as a lady and walking the grounds at her leisure. That was proof enough for Mrs. Vance. The Duke had some use for the girl, some fondness, and fondness could be squeezed for coin like water from a cloth. She sold what few things remained to her, hired a coach, and made the long journey north herself. The township that served the Duke's estate was a prosperous place, of grey stone houses and a fine market square, dominated at one end by the courthouse where the local magistrate held his sessions. It was there that Mrs. Vance took her scheme, dressed in her best black bombazine, her face arranged into the picture of a wronged and grieving woman. She filed a public grievance.
She stood before the magistrate, a stout and cautious man named Mr.
Pettigrew, and she wept and wrung her hands, and told a tale that bore no resemblance to the truth. The Duke, she declared, had come to her tavern in disguise and tricked her, a poor widow, out of her beloved stepdaughter. He had paid a trifling sum for what he claimed was a contract of service, concealing his true identity and his true intentions. And now he held the girl against her will, a gentlewoman's daughter locked away in his great house, unable to return to the family that loved her.
"I want my girl back," Mrs. Vance sobbed, dabbing at dry eyes with a black handkerchief. "Or, if his grace will not part with her, then let him pay a fair price for the injury he has done us. £10,000, sir, and not a penny less, for the theft of my daughter and the ruin of my good name." Word of the grievance reached the estate by nightfall.
Arthur received it in the library, where Arya now sat with him most evenings, reading her father's journals aloud or listening to his tales of the war.
A footman brought the magistrate's summons on a silver tray, and Arthur read it once, his face going still and hard.
"What is it?"
Arya asked. He handed her the paper without a word. She read it, and the color drained from her cheeks.
"She has come here," she whispered. "She has followed us all this way, and she is calling you a thief, and me your prisoner."
Her voice cracked.
£10,000, or my return. She means to drag me back, or bleed you white."
"She means to do neither," Arthur said. His voice was quiet, but there was iron beneath it.
He rose and went to the window, looking out into the dark toward the distant lights of the township. "She has made a grave error, that woman. She thinks a duke will pay any sum to avoid a scandal. She thinks I will hand her a fortune to keep this quiet, or hand her you to be rid of her." He turned back, and his gray eyes were cold as winter stone. "She does not know me, and she does not know what I hold."
"What you hold?"
"The contract she signed, in her own hand before witnesses at that tavern, selling your service of her own free will for gold she took gladly, and more than that." He crossed to the desk and drew open a drawer, lifting out a thick folder of papers bound in ribbon. "When I made my inquiries these past years, Arya, I did not only learn where you were, I learned a great deal about the state of your father's estate, and about how his debts came to be so vast so quickly after his death. There are matters in these papers your stepmother would very much prefer no magistrate ever examined. Matters of moneys that were your father's, and yours by right, that found their way into her purse by means that will not bear looking at."
Arya stared at him.
"You mean she stole from us? From my father's estate? From me?"
"I mean," Arthur said, "that she has walked into a court of law crying fraud, and she has not the wit to see that fraud is a game two may play, and that only one of us has clean hands." He set the folder down upon the desk. "She demands a public hearing. Very well, she shall have one. But when the day comes, it will not be my name that leaves that courthouse in ruins." He looked at Arya then, and his hard expression softened. "I would not go to war over money, Arya. Money I have in plenty, and care nothing for. But she has come into my county and called you a chattel to be bought and sold, and she has slandered your father's memory to do it. That I will not suffer." He laid his scarred hand flat upon the folder of papers. "She wished for a reckoning. She shall have one. And I promise you this, when it is done, that woman will never trouble you again for as long as she lives." Outside, far below in the valley, the lights of the township glimmered on, and in a rented room above the market square, Mrs. Vance counted her dwindling coins and dreamed of the fortune she was certain she would soon collect. She had no notion at all of the storm she had called down upon her own head.
Arthur made his decision the next morning, and it was not the one Arya expected. She had supposed he would keep her hidden away, safe behind the estate walls until the magistrate's business was settled and her stepmother sent packing.
Instead, over breakfast, he set down his cup and said, "The autumn gala is in 2 days' time. It is held each year at the great house in the capital of the county, and every family of note will be there. I mean for you to attend, and I mean for you to be presented as what you are, the daughter of Captain Ellery, a gentleman and a soldier, and my honored guest."
Arya's fork stilled in her hand.
You cannot mean it. After what those people said in the conservatory, they planned to humiliate me, to shame you through me. And now my stepmother is here, telling her lies to anyone who will listen? If I appear at that gala, I hand them the very stage they have been hoping for.
"You do," Arthur agreed, "and that is precisely why we shall take it." He leaned forward. "Think, Arya. If you hide, you prove them right. You become the shameful secret they say you are, the tavern girl the Duke keeps locked away. But if you walk into that hall with your head high, in a gown as fine as any duchess's, and speak as the well-bred young woman your father raised you to be, then what weapon have they left? A rumor cannot survive the sight of its own falsehood standing plainly in the room."
Arya was quiet a long moment. She thought of the sneering voices behind the ferns, of her stepmother's dry tears before the magistrate, of every person who had counted her worthless because of where she had been born and what she had done to survive. And she felt something rise in her that she had not felt in years, since before her father died. Not fear, defiance.
"Then I shall go," she said, "and I shall not give them the satisfaction of a single flinch."
Arthur's face broke into the first full smile she had ever seen from him, and it transformed him utterly, years falling away, warmth flooding into the weathered lines.
"There," he said softly. "There is Captain Ellery's daughter."
The 2 days that followed were unlike anything Arya had ever known.
Arthur summoned the finest people money could bring to the estate. A dressmaker arrived from the capital with 2 assistants and a coach full of silks, and Arya stood for hours upon a stool in the blue chamber while they draped and pinned and measured her, arguing softly over shades of rose and ivory and the palest shell pink. In the end, they settled upon a gown of deep sapphire silk, cut in the elegant, high-waisted fashion of the day, with delicate silver embroidery at the hem and sleeves, and Arya, catching sight of herself in the tall glass, scarcely knew the young woman who looked back. Gone was the shabby tavern girl in her patched gray dress. In her place stood someone who might indeed have been the daughter of a captain, straight-backed and clear-eyed. But Arthur had not sent for the dressmaker alone. A dancing master came, a lean and courtly old gentleman, and he spent long hours in the music room teaching Arya the figures of the quadrille and the country dances, guiding her through the steps with patient hands until her feet learned to move without her thinking. A tutor came too, an elderly lady of impeccable breeding who taught Arya the small language of gentle society, how to curtsy to a countess and how to a mere baronet's wife, how to hold a fan, when to speak and when to hold her tongue, how to turn a cruel remark aside with a smile so gracious it left the speaker looking the fool. Arya learned quickly. She had always learned quickly, and she found, to her own surprise, that much of it was not so very foreign to her after all. Her father had raised her among books and courtesy. The Polish had only been buried, not lost, beneath 3 years of scrubbed floors and swallowed pride. Arthur watched over all of it, quietly. He did not hover, did not fuss, but Arya felt his care in 100 small ways. A note left upon the pianoforte, telling her she need not fear, that her father's blood in her was worth more than any duchess's title.
a ribbon of deep blue, the shade of her new gown, that appeared upon her dressing table, with no word of who had left it. And on the evening before the gala, when she came down to supper, weary and uncertain, she found upon her plate a small velvet box, and within it a delicate silver locket. She opened it, and inside was the miniature of her mother, the portrait from the wooden box, cleaned and set behind glass. "So that she may go with you," Arthur said from the head of the table, "and stand beside you in that room. You go as no one's charity, Arya. You go as your father's daughter and your mother's. Let no one there forget it, least of all yourself." Arya could not speak. She closed her hand around the locket and simply nodded, her eyes shining. And Arthur inclined his head as though he understood everything she could not say. That night, she stood at her window, looking out over the moonlit lake, the locket warm in her palm. And she felt the last of the frightened girl from the tavern fall away. She thought of her stepmother, down in the township, so certain of her victory. She thought of the noble schemers with their whispered plans. And she found that she was no longer afraid of any of them. Let them try to shame her. Let them bring up the tavern, the debt, the gold on the table. She would meet every barb with grace, and she would stand beside the man who had crossed a kingdom to keep faith with a dead friend, and she would not be moved. The next morning brought a further piece of news, carried up from the township by one of Arthur's men. Mrs. Vance, it seemed, had not been idle. Through flattery and a borrowed gown and a great deal of bold pretending, she had somehow contrived to secure an invitation to the very same gala, presenting herself as a grieving gentlewoman come to plead her cause before the finest families of the county. Arya received the news with a calm that surprised even herself. "Good," she said. "Let her come." Arthur studied her with quiet pride. "You are certain?" "I have run from that woman my whole life," Arya said. "Hidden from her tempers, swallowed her cruelties, borne her contempt. I will not run again." She lifted her chin. "Let her stand in that grand hall and make her accusations before every ear in the county. She has walked into a room where the truth is waiting for her. I only mean to be there to see it greet her." Arthur smiled, and this time there was something almost fierce in it, the smile of a soldier before a battle he knows he cannot lose.
"Then we go to the gala," he said, "and we end this together." The great hall of the county's finest house blazed with the light of 1,000 candles. Arya stepped down from the carriage on Arthur's arm, and the murmur that ran through the assembled guests was audible even over the music drifting from within. Heads turned, fans lifted, whispers passed from mouth to ear. Here was the Duke, who never came to such gatherings, arrived at last, and on his arm, a young woman in sapphire silk whom no one could name. Arya felt every eye upon her, and she did not falter. She lifted her chin, rested her gloved hand lightly upon Arthur's sleeve, and walked into the hall as her father had taught her, as though she belonged there, because she had decided that she did. They had not been within the great room 10 minutes before the first blade came. The noblewoman from the conservatory glided toward them through the crowd, resplendent in crimson, her husband a pace behind. Arya knew her at once by her voice, that lazy, drawling condescension she had heard behind the ferns. "Your Grace," the woman purred, sinking into a curtsy. "How very unexpected to see you here, and with such a charming companion. I do not believe we have been introduced." "Lady Whitmore," Arthur said evenly. "May I present Miss Arya Ellery, daughter of the late Captain Ellery, who served with distinction in the wars. My honored guest." "Ellery,"
Lady Whitmore turned the name over as though tasting something sour.
How curious. I had heard the strangest tale, Your Grace, that you had lately taken in a girl from some roadside tavern, a servant bought to settle a debt, but of course that could not be the same young person, could it?
The trap was sprung. All around them, conversation faltered as guests turned to listen, scenting scandal. This was the moment Lady Whitmore had planned, the public unmasking, the tavern girl exposed before the whole of society.
Arya felt Arthur tense beside her. But before he could speak, she stepped forward, and she smiled.
"You are very well informed, my lady," she said, her voice clear and warm and carrying.
"It is quite true. When my father died, I was left in the care of a stepmother who did not love me, and I worked in a tavern to keep bread on the table, as many an honest soul has done. I am not ashamed of it. My father served his country and came home with wounds and medals and very little else, and he raised me to believe that no honest work diminishes a person and no birth exalts one who has not earned it." She held Lady Whitmore's gaze. "His Grace was my father's dearest friend in the wars. He swore an oath to look after me should any harm befall my father, and when he learned how I was situated, he kept that oath, as men of honor do. I count it the greatest fortune of my life to stand under the protection of so faithful a man. Is that the tale you had heard, my lady? For it is the true one, and I am glad to tell it plainly to anyone who cares to hear." A silence fell, and then, from somewhere in the listening crowd, came a soft murmur of approval. An elderly countess nodded. A gentleman said, quite audibly, "Well spoken." Lady Whitmore's practiced smile curdled on her lips. She had come to expose a shameful secret, and had found instead a young woman who wore her past like a banner and turned it into a thing of dignity rather than disgrace. The scandal she had planned dissolved in her hands, and worse, she saw the sympathy of the room swinging quietly toward the girl she had meant to ruin. "Charming," she managed at last, and retreated into the crowd with her husband, thoroughly outmatched. But the evening's true reckoning had not yet come. It came a quarter-hour later, when a figure in borrowed black silk pushed her way to the center of the hall and raised her voice for all to hear.
"There she is!"
cried Mrs. Vance, flinging out an accusing hand toward Arya.
"There stands my stepdaughter, stolen from me by this man who calls himself a duke. He came to my door in disguise, deceived a poor widow, and carried the girl away against her will. I demand justice before all of you. Return my daughter to me, or pay for the wrong you have done."
The hall stirred with shock. Here was the grieving mother of the tale made flesh, weeping and pointing, and for a moment the sympathy of the room wavered, uncertain. Arthur stepped forward, and when he spoke, his voice filled the whole great hall without his ever raising it. "You demand justice, madam," he said. "Then justice you shall have, here, before every witness you could wish for." He drew from his coat the folder of papers, and he held it up.
"This woman claims I stole her daughter. Here is the contract she signed, in her own hand, before witnesses, selling that daughter's service to a stranger for gold she took most gladly. No one stole from her. She sold, freely and eagerly, and repented only when she learned the depth of the purse she might have emptied." A ripple of understanding moved through the crowd. "But there is more, and this the good people here should hear. When Captain Ellery died, he left an estate, modest but honest, and a daughter who was his rightful heir. Within a year that estate was stripped bare and drowned in debt. I have here the accountings, examined by lawyers of the highest standing, and they show plainly where that money went, not to creditors, into the purse of the very woman who now stands before you crying poverty and theft." He turned to face Mrs. Vance, and his gray eyes were merciless. "You did not lose her, madam. You robbed one. You plundered a dead soldier's estate, cheated his next generation of her inheritance, and then sold her like a chattel to be free of the last of your obligations. And now you have come into a court of law and into this hall to slander the man who saved her, hoping to squeeze a fortune from your own crime." He lowered the papers. "The magistrate has seen these accounts this very morning. There is a warrant sworn for your arrest for fraud against the Ellery estate. You have until dawn to quit this county, and you are never to return to it, nor to come within 100 miles of Miss Ellery again, upon pain of prosecution to the fullest measure of the law." Mrs. Vance's face went white as ash. She looked about the hall for a single sympathetic face and found none, only cold and knowing stares. Her scheme lay in ruins, her lies exposed before the very people she had hoped to win.
Without another word, she gathered her borrowed skirts and fled the hall, and the great doors closed behind her upon the last of her cruelty. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the elderly countess crossed the floor to Arya, took both her hands, and said warmly, "Your father would be proud, my dear. Come, you must tell me all about him. I knew a great many soldiers in my day." And just like that, the tavern girl was welcomed among them. Later, when the dancing had begun again and the candles burned low, Arya stepped out onto the terrace to catch her breath, and Arthur followed her into the cool night air. "It is finished," he said quietly. "She will trouble you no more. You are free, Arya, truly free at last. And you have your father's good name restored, and your inheritance shall be returned to you in full." Arya turned to him, this silent, faithful man who had crossed a kingdom for a promise, and she found her eyes were wet.
"You gave me back everything I thought I had lost,"
she said.
"My father, my mother, my name, myself."
She touched the locket at her throat.
"I came to your house believing I was sold into servitude, and I have found instead the only true home I have known since my father died."
"Then stay," Arthur said simply. "Not as a guest, not as a ward, as family, for as long as you wish it. This house has been too quiet and too cold for too many years. It has waited a long while for someone to bring it to life." He smiled, that rare and transforming smile. "Your father asked me to watch over you. He never said for how long. I find I am in no hurry to be done with the task." Arya laughed through her tears and slipped her hand into his scarred one, the hand that had signed her free, and together they stood on the terrace beneath the autumn stars, the war long over, the oath at last fulfilled, and a new life, bright and free, spread out before them like the dawn.